Hello, everybody. I'm Eric Schwartz, and I teach here as a visitor. But I'm really here to introduce George Biddle, and I'm absolutely delighted that George has been able to find the time to join us this afternoon, and he'll give a lecture, and then we're also going to take advantage of having him in at Princeton to be at a seminar this evening. George Biddle, who will speak about Iraq and refugees, is the senior vice president of the IRC. And for those of you who don't know, the IRC is the International Rescue Committee, one of the most important non-sectarian voluntary organizations providing relief, protection, rehabilitation, and resettlement services for victims of oppression, including refugees, and victims of violent conflict. IRC has not only played a critical role in implementation of programs, overseas assistance, as well as domestic U.S. resettlement of refugees, but also it has distinguished itself as a leader within the private voluntary community on advocacy, on policy advocacy on humanitarian issues, in no small measure due to George's influence at IRC. From 1997 through 1999, he was vice president of the International Crisis Group, also a critically important NGO committed to strengthening the capacity of the international community to respond to man-made crises. Before that, he was president of the Washington-based Institute for Central American Studies, a nonprofit organization he founded in 1989 to assist post-Cold War Central America in its transition from violent conflict to peace and democracy. And before founding that organization, George served as assistant to the president at the Institute for East-West Security Studies in New York from 1984 to 1986. When you get older in this, I guess in this field, you start forgetting when you met people. But I feel like I've known George. I don't know. I don't know when we met. But George has played a singularly important role in not only humanitarian programming but humanitarian advocacy. So it's a real pleasure to introduce him to you all.
Well, thank you, Eric. It's you were too kind in your introduction, but it's my pleasure to be introduced and to be invited here to speak to you all by Eric, who, as you all know, has been a leader. I should turn this on. Excuse me. Who's been a leader in the humanitarian cause for many years on Capitol Hill during the Clinton administration years as a professor at the UN, and he's been a wonderful colleague. And so thanks for having me. I appreciate it, Eric. I should just say it's a real pleasure for me to be at Princeton as well. The IRC and Princeton have a very close relationship on a number of levels. Our current president was an undergraduate here. We've got 3 or 4 board members who are all graduates. And a couple of them actually organized for the class of '56 to start the Princeton in Africa program, where 4 undergraduates each year go to Africa with the IRC. It means we've got a wonderful number of Princeton graduates working across the agency in many locations. And so I also want to just thank the Princeton community for this opportunity and for the great partnership that we have especially as it relates to Africa and its needs today. As I was driving up, I was thinking to myself that when I've discussed this topic with other audiences in the United States, many of them have asked me why the term crisis is in the title. And the reason for that is that so few Americans in particular, because that's the audience that I've been addressing most recently, are completely unaware of the Iraq refugee crisis, not to mention the entire displacement crisis. And we at the IRC have been trying to determine why that's the case, what the situation of those refugees currently is, and what we can help the international community to do about it. So I'm going to try and address those questions in my remarks. I'll try and keep my remarks to under half an hour so we can engage in a discussion about this, because there are a lot of issues that relate to this overarching humanitarian crisis. Frankly, the fastest growing humanitarian crisis in the world and one that we need to be much more aware of and much more aggressive about addressing. The start of this crisis began in February of 2006. It did not begin with the U.S. invasion of Iraq. It began with the sectarian violence, and in particular the bombing of the Shia mosque in Samarra on February 22nd, 2006. The bloodletting that was unleashed by that has literally driven over 3 million Iraqis from their homes. 1 million are internally displaced, and up to 2 million have fled to neighboring countries, primarily to Jordan and Syria. If you look at the numbers and the impact they're having, particularly on the host governments, Syria, the estimates are somewhere between 1 million to 1.5 million refugees in a country of about 18 to 19 million. It's roughly about 6 to 7% of their population. In the case of Jordan, it's 450 to 500,000 refugees in a country of about 500 to 600,000 people. And again, we're talking about 8% of their population. These are enormous numbers when you think about the strain. If you commensurately, did those statistics and applied it to the United States, you'd be talking about literally millions and millions of refugees that we would be hosting, were the situation to be the same here at the same percentage level. So it's happened in the last 2 years, and it's happened on a grand scale. I should maybe mention parenthetically, since I'm speaking from my position at the IRC, that the IRC was in Iraq. We actually prepared to go in following the U.S. invasion, anticipating that there would be refugee outflows and an internal displacement crisis as a result of the invasion. When in fact that did not occur, we slowly began to scale down operations as the security risks that we faced were not commensurate with the value we felt we could add from a perspective of a community-based humanitarian organization. We also did face a number of the issues that you've read about. We had one staff member killed, we had another staff member kidnapped, and we evaluate our own risks based on what we think we can accomplish. We're willing to take higher risks in places like Darfur or in Afghanistan if we feel that we can, if it gets to the threshold of life-saving, or that the difference between our presence and not can literally mean close to life or death circumstances for those that we work with. In Iraq, we felt more distant from the situation, and also felt that there were a number of other actors that could provide the needed services inside the country. So we had actually pulled back out of Iraq by early 2005. And I think many people in the international community who look at humanitarian issues were surprised at this sudden outflow that was not noticed immediately. I have to admit, I was on an airplane flight between New York and California when our board co-chair handed me an article from the Atlantic Monthly in October of 2006 showing the numbers that had been slowly aggregating in the neighboring countries, particularly Jordan and Syria. People did not see it as quickly as you would in, for instance, the Rwandan exodus following the genocide, or the Kosovo experience that Eric knew so well, when massive numbers fled into Macedonia or Albania. This happened sort of tens of thousands over a long period of time, and all of a sudden we were faced with a huge humanitarian crisis. Some people ask me when I speak on this topic, well, is it a particular portion of the population? What does the refugee population look like when you go and visit them? And I've had 2 trips out to the region in the last 4 months. I was in Jordan in November of last year, and I just came back from a trip to Jordan and Syria this February. It's a real cross-section of Iraqi society. There are Sunnis, Shia, Christian, other minorities, Sabian and Mandaean communities. So from a sectarian standpoint, it's a cross-section. From an economic and social standpoint, it is as well. There are affluent, middle class, and poor Iraqis. There are professors and engineers. There are day laborers and barbers. There are former employees of the U.S. government. There are women, children, and the elderly. And they really represent a cross-section of Iraq that obviously we would like to see both protected and well cared for, but also ready to return on a safe and voluntary basis to help rebuild their society. So the question is, how do you have 2 million refugees that initially went a little bit unnoticed and frankly today are really not headline stories? If there was a camp of 2 million Iraqis in the desert in Jordan or Syria, or a series of 10 camps of 100,000 or more, I think we'd see much greater press attention, and there'd be much more involvement by both the media and the international community to address this crisis? Well, there was initially individuals who left, and they did have resources, and they rented apartments. They stayed with families. Jordan had a law in its books that anyone that could put $100,000 in a bank account immediately got a residency permit. So people with, you do what you can. And so in the case of Jordan, they saw an opportunity, to at least bring in people who could invest in their country. So there certainly was this sense in the early stages that it was just people with resources and it didn't need to be addressed. There were family members they could stay with initially. Most people, though, what they did is they sold everything they had and they crossed the borders and they rented apartments in the poorer sections of Damascus and Amman and Beirut and Cairo and other capitals in the Middle East. They moved with their families and they kept their head low. They just weren't sure. Jordan and Syria were enormously generous to open their borders, but they weren't sure if they might change their minds. And neither country is a signatory to the Refugee Convention, so they weren't immediately granted refugee status. They were treated as guests, and they weren't permitted the opportunity to work. And so they began to expend their savings, and the situation began to deteriorate for a large number of these individuals as a result. When I took a group out there just in February, a number of eminent Americans from our board and overseers, we had a chance to do a number of home visits. We met with large groups of refugees at community centers that we support. We had a chance to meet with large numbers of them at the UN High Commissioner for Refugees office in both Amman and Damascus. And I would say the overwhelming commonality that they share is an exposure to extreme violence. The trauma that this population has experienced can just not be underestimated. UNHCR surveys indicate that up to 70% of the individuals that they have surveyed and interviewed have either had a family member killed, had a family member kidnapped, been a witness to a bombing, or been in a neighborhood where people have been killed. And to have 70% with a direct tie to that, with a direct experience, even in some of the most horrific refugee crises, oftentimes refugees flee in advance of having that violence arrive on their doorstep. So this is a very high number. And the conditions that they face today, as I mentioned, their savings are running out, so they're low on cash. They are not legally allowed to work in any of the countries. Lebanon, I believe, has just actually changed its laws around that, but there's a much smaller number than in the other countries I've mentioned. They have limited access to health care. Some can access emergency health care, but with the trauma they've experienced, a number of them have health conditions that we would associate with the developed societies in the West and other parts of the world. There's high rates of heart disease, diabetes, and cancer. So they actually need significant, sophisticated health care, and it's very difficult for them to access that. They have limited access to education. Both countries, and I say both because Jordan and Syria are really the countries that have shouldered the burden, have allowed Iraqi children to enter school, and they have tried their best to encourage them to do so. But because there is this doubt among the refugee population's mind as to whether they will be permitted to stay in the country, they feel that anything that raises their head above sight level, puts them in the view of the authorities, could potentially hamper their ability to remain in the country and take advantage of the protection that the host governments have offered. So even though there has been a real effort to begin to get these kids into school, there are still a number of families who are reluctant to do so. The fact that they're running out of resources means that they are facing the inability to pay for rent, to pay for food, and to generally just take care of themselves. One family I visited on this recent trip, a group that had lived in Baghdad for many years, the husband was I believe, a pathologist. He had been kidnapped and murdered. His wife had prepared to take the family out. Before she was able to do so, her daughter was sexually assaulted. and they finally fled the country. When I met her and she greeted me at the door of her apartment, she was wearing dark glasses and indicated that she couldn't see. She had gone steadily blind during the 18 months since her arrival in the country from untreated high blood pressure. She did have very tiny ability to see, but very minimal. She was one of the fortunate. She was on a wait list to be resettled to Australia. And I'll come to the solutions to this crisis in time, of which resettlement is a critical issue. But we've got a food shortage that's growing. We have the inability to survive, an increase in crime, the potential for prostitution, the ability of unsavory actors to take advantage of these vulnerable populations in a way that is detrimental to family structure, social well-being, and just your own sense of purpose and the ability to lead a productive life. The sense that we got during this most recent trip was a sense of hopelessness among this population, a sense of living in limbo, and a sense that the international community and a number of other actors were both unaware and unable to address the crisis. So one of the things that we wanted to look at from the trip that I recently took with a series of our senior leaders were what are the kinds of actions that we could encourage the international community to undertake to address this enormous human tragedy. Well, there are really only three primary durable solutions for refugees. You can safely and voluntarily return to your country. You can resettle to a third country, or you can integrate into the societies to which you fled and find protection within them. Well, frankly, none of these are currently available to this population. In the case of safe voluntary return, there was quite a bit of media coverage in November and December of last year that thousands of refugees were returning from Syria back to Iraq. When we both asked refugees about this when we were in the country, and subsequently HCR, as run a UN High Commissioner for Refugees, had undertaken some general surveys, the primary purposes that we understood that incentivized the refugees to return were really twofold. One was a change in visa policy in Syria where to stay in the country you had to reapply for a visa at what was a hefty cost to the refugees. And the second was that the government of Iraq was offering $800 to each family that wanted to return. And of course the surge was taking hold in Baghdad, so there was a sense that security might be growing as well. So it was a combination of these forces that did encourage a number of the refugees to get on buses and return to their neighborhoods in Baghdad and other parts of the country. With the anecdotal evidence that I was able to find during my trip, the information flowed back quickly because, of course, these are very sophisticated individuals. They have cell phones, and we're talking about a fairly tight geographic area. They're able to call back to their relatives, their friends, and their families and give them an indication of whether this was a good idea or not. And many felt it clearly was not, that the situation was not secure and stable enough. In many cases, families experienced violence again, or they found their homes occupied by other individuals, and they weren't sure how to address that issue because the mechanisms don't exist right now in Iraq for restitution of property that's been taken. And there were just a number of challenges. Not to mention, they ended up going to places where they were not living before. So they faced a number of challenges, and a few immediately left again. So the sense that there was and is a sort of an ongoing return and a solution to this problem is not one that is in fact occurring. Every indication we've had is that refugees are still leaving Iraq to the neighboring countries, maybe not in as high numbers as at the outset of the crisis in 2006 by any means, but still a flow across the borders. So what is needed in the near term are a number of actions. The first of which, if you can't provide safe voluntary return, and I think in anyone's analysis, obviously, if people can go home and live safely in the communities and in the societies they lived in, traditionally that's what refugees and individual human beings would like, unless they're so traumatized and so overtaken by what they've experienced that they never want to return. And there's always going to be large numbers of populations within a crisis that will want to be resettled or stay where they are. But of course, a lot of these individuals and Iraqi citizens are ones that are going to be a key backbone to rebuilding the country. And so I think it's important that they have the opportunity to return, and the question is how to help prepare the way for that over time. But it's not going to happen anytime soon. At least there doesn't seem to be an indication of that. So we've got to prepare for a period of time where we sustain these populations where they are, and also look at alternative solutions for them. The first is just the resources that are needed. The estimates, if you talk to government officials from Jordan or Syria, the estimates of what it costs for them to host these populations are, close to $1 billion in terms of everything from water and electricity and food and the strains on the school systems and on the healthcare institutions and all the other services that these refugees are accessing as guests in the society. So the needs are tremendous on a bilateral level. We've issued a report that we think on average up to $900 million is needed annually just to support the needs of Jordan, Egypt, and Lebanon. In the case of Syria, where it's very unlikely the U.S. would provide bilateral assistance, we feel that the U.S. does have to engage Syria on the question of the Iraqi refugees and needs to work through the UN and NGO partners to directly assist the refugees within Syria and allow others to step up and support the government's principal providers within the society, which are the health and education ministries. In terms of the UN consolidated appeals, the consolidated appeals this year will likely reach about $800 million, maybe even $900 million. It's nowhere near being funded on an international level. The U.S. traditionally funds about a third of those appeals in a given instance. We feel that the U.S. really has to step up and show leadership and provide at least 50% of the consolidated UN appeals, which would be for both displaced Iraqis inside of Iraq and the refugee population that has fled to the surrounding region. But it's not just up to the U.S. Alone, and it does mean that our European and Western counterparts, as well as the Gulf states in the region, and the government of Iraq itself has to step up as well. To date, we're only aware of $10 million contribution offered to the UN appeal from one of the Gulf Arab states in the last year. And in the case of Iraq, the Iraqi government at last year's UNHCR conference offered $25 million. I believe $17 million of that has been actually paid out. But if you think of the oil reserves they're sitting on and the wealth that the Iraqi government currently does have, they need to step up and be a leader in working with their neighbors to address their population's needs as they prepare to welcome them back home. In terms of protection within the societies to which they fled, we would obviously very much endorse Jordan and Syria signing the High Commissioner's Refugee Convention, the Convention for Refugees, and providing all the protections that flow from that. Short of that, the most critical element would be some sort of temporary work status, something that gives the refugees the right to stay in the country and participate in the economy to be able to survive and to be able to provide for their families. The challenge, of course, is that the economic climate in the region right now is very tough. When we arrived in Jordan, the Jordanian government, due to very high oil prices, they're not an oil-producing country, had just had to cut back on subsidies for oil and food for their own population. So the strains of trying to provide jobs to a population of, let's say, 400,000 to 500,000 people in a society that already has its own economic challenges are not insignificant. So these are some of the challenges that those countries face from the perspective of providing long-term protection and guest status with some kind of element that provides a legal underpinning to their right to stay in those two countries and in the region, in other countries, Egypt and Lebanon. I focused heavily just because the numbers are so great, in particular in Jordan and Syria. What about resettlement? I suppose there's been some coverage in the press about the U.S.'s ability to resettle refugees here. It's a hallmark of what the United States stand for. The definition that the U.S. uses, you have to meet a well-founded fear of persecution to be brought in under the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program. On average, the U.S., going back about 25 years, brings in somewhere around 100,000 to 120,000 refugees a year, give or take. It's dropped off since 9/11, but certainly the capacity exists. It's peaked in some years up to 200,000 during the 80s. So the capacity exists to be able to absorb large numbers of resettled refugees, and I think it speaks to the values that Americans as citizens treasure. Historically, there were some antecedents to emergency resettlement. Eric worked on the Kosovo crisis during the Clinton administration, where some 20,000 Kosovars were airlifted to Fort Dix in New Jersey, so they could be processed and brought into the country quickly as a form of protection. During the end of the Vietnam War, President Ford stood up and led an effort, both working with both sides of the aisle in Congress, to pass the Vietnam Refugee Act of 1975, which brought in 131,000 Vietnamese in a 6-month period between May and December of 1975. And that was an effort that then continued on under Carter. There are differences in each crisis, so I can't say that every crisis is exactly alike, but there are certainly precedents of leadership where resources and political will can be brought to bear. And in the case of a foreign country, Sweden brought in over 20,000 Iraqi asylum seekers during the last year. That's a country of just 9 million people. They are tightening their policies, I understand, but if you look at that as a percentage of their population, we can get into the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Iraqis were we, again, to make that comparison. So what has the U.S. done to date? So they brought in 800 Iraqis from the start of the war till the fiscal year 2007. They brought in 1,608 Iraqis last year. They've committed to bring 12,000 in this year, and to date we've seen just around 3,000 during the first 6 months. So we're obviously not even meeting our own fairly, I would say, very under-aggressive targets. So we need to do better. There was an amendment passed to the Defense Authorization Bill, spearheaded by Senator Kennedy, to address one aspect of this, which is for those Iraqis who had worked with American military, contractors, media, NGOs, anyone who served with an American entity in Iraq. Previously, the limit was 500 between Iraq and Afghanistan, between the two combined. This legislation, which is passed, increased that number to 5,000 annually for what are called special immigrant visas. And that includes their dependents. So you could see up to 12, maybe even 13 or 14,000, depending upon the size of the family. And of course, these people are extremely vulnerable. The IRC still has workers who are living in Iraq who had served with our organization, who were being targeted 3 years after we had left the country. So the risks are real. And we need to get moving quickly to fund the Special Immigrant Visa Program, to get rid of the bottlenecks on a bureaucratic level, and to move quickly. There's been a debate now as to whether the legislation takes hold in September of 2008 for the coming fiscal year or now, and they're trying to work that through. But we need to move quickly. And there are some challenges related to it in terms of how you process individuals within Iraq or in Jordan and Syria. But I do think that with energy and extra resources and a real commitment that these challenges can be overcome. Lastly, one of the things that we felt, and when I say we, I talk about both the IRC, its leadership, and some of the individuals I traveled with on my recent visit to the region, is that we need to lift this crisis out of the shadows. And one of the ways to do that would be to convene a regional conference at the highest levels, convened by the Secretary General, that would include foreign ministers from the host governments that are housing refugees, from the Iraqi government, regional entities, major donor governments, and the major UN entities and agencies to come together to look at the crisis in all its complexities, to try and pinpoint current needs, to try and harness the resources from those that have it to address current needs, both internally and externally, and to begin to develop some planning for how one thinks about a long-term solution to this, which means sustaining displaced populations in the near term as you begin to identify what actions you would need to take to allow people to return to their homes, should that be their choice. So we'd like to see that. I also think it's important for the leader of this country and the leader here in the United States, the U.S. president, to stand up and talk about this issue and really address it head on. And certainly there are leaders within the executive branch and within Congress who have addressed this crisis head on, but it does require presidential leadership, and it requires more than has been seen to date. And when I think about it, I sometimes think of Al Gore's movie on the environment, An Inconvenient Truth. Because the fact is that this population exists, and in this case I'm talking about the refugees that have fled Iraq. We didn't travel inside of Iraq, so I don't want to get into the issues related to internal displacement because I don't feel as well versed, because it is a separate number of variables, and I'm glad to take some questions if I can be helpful on that topic. But there's no question that we need to lift this crisis out of the shadows and put the kinds of resources in terms of financial and human resource, financial resource, mental capacity, and international teamwork to address it. Because the fact is that these people are living in very difficult circumstances. Maybe I'd end with one last individual, a professor at the University of Baghdad who I met on my trip in November. He volunteered that he was a Shia, and his wife was a kindergarten teacher teaching girls. And about 6 months after the Samarra bombing, he was first threatened by some Shia colleagues, and then he was threatened by some Sunni insurgents, and then he was threatened by al-Qaeda in Iraq. And he felt it was just unsustainable to stay. And so he and his wife and their young daughter left the country. And when I asked him what he felt about his current situation and who was to blame, he, in a very professorial mode, said, well, the sectarian violence is what is the direct cause of my displacement. And we pressed a little further, and we asked him what was the, does he have any other views on his current predicament? And he said, well, indirectly, of course, the U.S. invasion unleashed that. So there's obviously a feeling among a number of the refugees that the U.S. bears a heavy responsibility in this. And so U.S. leadership has got to be critical in mobilizing others to stand up and act. And it won't be just the U.S. alone that can solve this. It does require regional cooperation. It requires involvement of the UN. It requires support from donor governments that have the capacity to give. And we will, at the IRC, be working to push some of those solutions in the hopes that they will begin to ease the plight of the Iraqi refugees and also begin to help address the plight of the internally displaced in Iraq. Thank you. Yes.
You mentioned the question of presidential leadership and also American culpability for a lot of this issue, and I have kind of two questions if I can do that. One, while we're trying to get some reaction out of this current administration, what kind of work have you been doing with the, at this point, 3 viable presidential candidates in order to have them ready on whichever one on day one is willing to pick this up, either to continue whatever you've been able to do with the current administration, or if nothing has been done. And I think, and in terms of moving this administration, I saw some quotes from John Bolton, I think, while he was still at the UN, who took a remarkably Darwinian view of the refugee problem, and that we really shouldn't be doing anything to make their situation comfortable in their temporary homes, because this would just preclude them from going home. It was stunning in its callousness. How much is that thought? Do you still hear that within the corridors of Washington? So Washington now, Washington January.
Let me answer the second part of your question first and then move to the other. No, I have to admit I've never heard that level of callousness, to be fair,
Yeah.
to the administration. They are, in their minds, raising more resources within the budget process. They have to date this year given $208 million to the general needs of the displaced Iraqis, as well as IDPs, as we call them, internally displaced persons, as well as refugees. They've got two levels of coordinators. They've got the Undersecretary of State working a task force, and then they have a special ambassador, Jim Foley, addressing the needs of the refugees in particular. And I think there is an awareness that they need to keep building that effort. I think there's probably somewhat of an awareness that this also will be a solution that will ultimately be, or a crisis, and the solution will be addressed by the incoming administration, and that solutions will be found by the next administration. But they certainly have come forward in the last year. They have opened a small dialogue with Syria to get Department of Homeland Security processing circuit riders, as they call them, individuals that pre-screen and view the security requirement, undertake the security clearances for refugees in the host government, in the host countries. So we've seen some actions both on a financial level in terms of getting the U.S. bureaucracy to help resettle refugees more quickly. But frankly, we think that needs to be increased dramatically based on the scale of the crisis and our relationship to it. And that means providing, if you think about the estimates on what has been spent on overall war efforts in Iraq since the start of the war, I mean, some of the most conservative is somewhere in the $600 to $700 billion range. So to ask for a couple of $1 billion a year to address the humanitarian fallout doesn't seem like really an enormous amount of money. So I think we need to see more resources. We need to keep pressing for higher numbers. There are certainly obstacles related to these issues that exist, but I don't believe they can be, that they're so insurmountable that they can't be overcome. So, but I've never heard a viewpoint such as Mr. Bolton's voiced. And of course, there are a number, and Eric knows this well, there are a number of partners inside the U.S. government who are individuals who work these crises and want to see the administration step up and do more. And sometimes they can't speak out themselves, but would like to see us be more assertive in our response. In terms of what the IRC has done with the presidential candidates, it's on our to-do list. We have plans to actually sit down with a number of top advisors in each of the campaigns, all three at the moment, and we'll carry those meetings out as quickly as we can. We did take out an ad, very unprecedented for the IRC, in the op-ed page of the New York Times last week when General Petraeus and Ambassador Crocker were testifying, to just kind of put a marker down for people who read the opinion page of the New York Times, that we felt this was an issue that merited national attention and should rise to the level of an issue that would be considered in a presidential debate, and we will do our darndest to make sure that happens. Whether we can succeed or not. We're not alone in this. I talk about we. There are a number of NGOs that work this issue in Washington, from the human rights and the humanitarian community. There's just been some remarkable work done by a number of other organizations as well. And we've all been working together to address this. We just had a day in Washington, the Iraqi forum, where a number of agencies got together. They held meetings and panels at George Washington University that involved a number of officials from both the Hill and the administration. And so we're working it as a community and trying to drive attention towards it. And there are obviously, through that attention, some of the ideas that we think need to be acted on.
You spoke a lot about the governments of Jordan and Syria, their responses to the refugee population. I'm just wondering how well the actual people of Jordan and Syria have reacted to the refugee population.
Well, I think, when you look at the economic climate, it's difficult. When you have a large number of people coming into your society, when your own situation isn't particularly terrific to begin with. You have to think the first response has been enormously generous. The numbers, 500,000 in Jordan and somewhere between 1 million and 1.5 million in Syria, it's pretty remarkable if you think about it. And they're living in neighborhoods across the cities. there's no question that there's some tension at the same time. It would be, very odd if it were just completely a warm and cozy welcome. That having been said, of course, the governments are anxious about the potential for instability as a result of large populations living in their own communities in terms of the economic fallout, the potential for any kind of strife that might be brought in cross-border. We actually had a meeting with President Assad when we were there. We had about an hour. And he talked very openly about the pressures on his school system, the need for more resources. He's very focused on the education side of it, wants to get the refugee children into schools, but knows that it's very difficult for Syria as a whole to be able to deal with that. It's hard for us. We didn't go in and speak to large numbers of Jordanians and Syrians to see how they feel about it. I would say there's probably a little more tension perhaps in Jordan right now just because of a slightly even more difficult economic climate. But it's a very hard thing to measure in that regard. And certainly there's an awareness among both governments that they've got to pay very close attention to this because in addition to the humanitarian dimension, there's also regional sort of dynamics that are at play as a result of having that number of people pushed into very smaller countries than Iraq. So there's a natural concern at the government level, and I think you can see everything from probably some antipathy in some neighborhoods, and obviously welcome at the same time. I don't have any. It's very hard. We haven't done. I haven't seen a public opinion survey poll or anything to that effect to be able to answer that with any greater specificity. Yes.
Do you have any sense of taking all of the refugees together, whether it's evenly divided between Shias and Sunnis, or more of one or more of the other?
It's really difficult. Some would say there's probably a higher Sunni presence in Jordan because it's primarily Sunni society, and Syria has a slightly more multi-sectarian makeup. It has a number of minority as well as Shia and Sunni. But I don't have a sense of the numbers broken out particularly. And there are a number of religious minorities that have been very brutalized in this. I've not been aware of the Mandaean and Sabian communities. There were 13,000 in Iraq, and I think 11,000 of them have fled, and they suffered some of the worst atrocities. They are a religious minority that is in great need of resettlement because there is a certain point at which the persecution is so intense that you really do have to think about establishing a life elsewhere. But as a breakout, I don't have a perfect understanding as what the percentages are. But it is it's very mixed. I mean, when just again anecdotally, I met a wide variety of individuals in terms of what their religious affiliations were and what their backgrounds, professional, economic. It's a real wide swath. It's a cross-cutting portion of the Iraqi population. Yes.
I think towards the end of your remarks, you made a comment about the IRC's work with refugees and it started its work with internally displaced people. And I just wondered sort of to what extent the organization has been involved with IDPs thus far, and ultimately how will it, what criteria will it use to divide up its attention and resources between the needs of IDPs and the needs of refugees?
That's a very good question. We made a decision to go back into Iraq last year and have reestablished a presence in Erbil at the early part of this year in the north, which is more stable, as you know, in the Kurdish area. And we're doing three things. We are directly implementing some programs in the north around education needs, in particular reconstructing a school that's got a very multi-sectarian mix up in Erbil. We're also providing grants through our office there and in Amman and New York to Iraqi NGOs that are directly assisting IDPs in every part of the country. One of the things that's very important if you're going to work in Iraq is to make sure that you're working in all regions and addressing displacement in all parts of the country. So we've been working with NGOs in the central region and the south. There's a group that helps to coordinate the NGO community that we've been supporting as well. The Iraqi Youth League is another. So we're working through partners at the moment. We have not sent expatriate staff, and frankly, the IRC's international workforce is mainly made up of leaders from the countries in which we work. So we're We're working primarily through Iraqi partners and our own Iraqi staff at the moment. But it's certainly a critical element. One of the issues that that internally displaced face is that some of the governorates in Iraq have closed their own borders inside of Iraq. So even if you want to move within Iraq to escape some of the violence, it can be difficult to move from one governorate to the next. So we plan to increase our presence, and as security permits, to move more and more into other regions of the country. But we're going to take that on a very careful basis, because of course if you encounter such security problems, all it does is either delay or freeze your operations, or ultimately perhaps force you to withdraw. So, yes.
Thank you for your talk. If you permit me actually to follow up on the question of sectarian breakdown, FAFO, which is a Norwegian aid and research organization, released a study in November, particularly on Jordan, that said that it was 68% Sunni, about 17% Shia, and 12% Christian. And the numbers are probably larger for
That's
Shia.
very good. You have those. Did you have that right there off the top of your head? Or are you pulling it up? That's very good. That's great. Yeah.
Well, I pulled it up. But
I was like, wow.
Having a computer.
so Human Rights Watch, and the numbers are probably larger for Shia in Syria, because Human Rights Watch had reported that before Jordan closes borders to all the refugees, they close them to the Shia, and they were explicitly barring the Shia from coming in. So that probably has something to do with that skew as well. My question is, what happens when people don't want to go back? I mean, for a long time, people were they had people back in Iraq checking on their homes and sending them pictures of their homes to make sure they were still there. And I've heard that, to a large extent, people have stopped doing that. I think people have kind of resigned themselves to not returning. And so what happens if that happens, or how long can this possibly be sustained, even with aid from the international community?
Well, I think, of course, in the case of Jordan, it's been hosting a large Palestinian population for many years. This is a real concern. Are they facing another 20 or 30-year situation where they'll be taking care of another population from the region? So, a code among humanitarians is safe and voluntary return. And when that actually the conditions will exist is very unclear. And as I mentioned earlier, there will also be a certain percentage that will never want to return, either for what they experienced or their perception of what they're returning to is not worth the risk. I think until at least you see conditions improve so that people have a fair basis to make that decision, that you're not going to be able to actually analyze what the potential is for a very long-standing population. I mean, it's interesting, this week just to use a corresponding international situation, this week in Pakistan, there are a number of camps being closed by the government of Pakistan for Afghan populations that have lived in that country, some of them since the Soviet invasion in '79. They've grown up in Pakistan, many of the individuals, because they were born there, of parents who had originally fled Afghanistan during the '79 invasion. And conditions have improved in Afghanistan, obviously, but they don't necessarily, not all of them, believe that it is safe, or do they have a home to return to, or are they sure that they'll be able to earn a living once they return. So some are literally waiting till the bulldozers come to knock out the camps. One is called Jalazai, hosting upwards of 50,000 refugees. And so the question is it truly a voluntary decision? And when it's not, then what are the mechanisms? UNHCR has a very interesting program that it's trying to develop where some grants could be made to local communities to try and integrate some of these individuals into Pakistan society. So this is where resources make a big difference. It could be that you might see the potential to integrate some of these refugees, when I'm talking about these, in this case, Iraqis in, let's say, Jordan or Syria, if resources were made available to support the infrastructure and the economy to perhaps take some of them in. But it's going to have to be, a portion. I mean, the long-term solution for the vast majority will be safe and voluntary return. Some, hopefully, could be potentially integrated, but that's something that really has to be looked at based on what the conditions might be for return, what are the grievances, how long they may stay there. These are things that, the governments of Jordan and Syria, as well as Lebanon and Egypt and others, are not prepared to face right now. And unfortunately, no matter how you look at it, as aggressive as I was talking about resettlement is still a tiny percentage of the overall, as a solution, it's going to represent a very small percentage of refugees in the world finding a durable solution to their displacement crisis. On average, only about 200,000 are resettled annually across the world, of which the U.S. normally takes about half. And there are right now around 12 million refugees around the globe. So it's a very small percentage. But it does need to be addressed more aggressively because obviously the U.S. can do more, but so can Europe and Britain and other countries. They could certainly bring in more than they have for those that are at the, at the greatest, in the greatest danger as it relates to the persecution that they face both in Iraq and potentially even in the societies that they now live in. So it's very hard. That's one of the toughest questions to answer. Yes?
Yeah, a related problem about the Palestinian refugee in Jordan. How many are they? They are unfortunately never be allowed to return. It's very likely they will never be allowed. Are they integrated, or is another problem waiting for sure?
I'm not an expert on it, but I mean, they live in Amman, in many parts of Amman, as Iraqis do, and they've lived there a long time. And I'm not an expert on what the Jordanian, legal sort of mandates are as it relates to it. But what I think that the issue here is just the sense of taking on yet another large population. If you think about Jordan as a country of 5 million people, 450 to 500,000 is a large number.
Have you an idea how many of those 5 million people are Palestinian?
I think the number is around 2 million. Yes.
To what extent has the sectarian violence that's generated all these refugees actually increased sectarian tensions among the refugees themselves? In sort of talking to the refugees, do you see a lot of people expressing bitterness and hatred for other sects, or an unwillingness to return to their formerly mixed neighborhoods?
Anecdotally, I'd say it's the opposite. Literally, we'd be at meetings with Christians, Sunni, Shia. And many of them said, we were a society that, this was not an issue. Obviously, some of the grievances existed, as we know, in terms of Shia uprising following the 1990 Gulf War and the attempts to overthrow Saddam. So there are certainly fissures in the society, but among the refugees we met with, not at the level that they would have imagined could have brought the level of violence that exists today. Yes?
What is the criteria that the United States government, when they're considering whether or not to grant refugee status for someone from Iraq to come into the United States, how is that determined?
In terms of what the actual definition is so there's a large
priority over other people?
Yeah, so there's a large definition which is a well-founded fear of persecution. Then the question is how you get below that, and there are sort of a number of categories. They're called P1 through P5. P1 is a referral from the High Commissioner for Refugees to the United States. That is the primary vehicle that the U.S. is currently using to identify refugees for resettlement. So the UNHCR actually pre-screens them and identifies individuals who meet that criteria and then pass them on to the U.S. to be, it's a very complicated process, to be then pre-screened by something called an overseas processing entity, which prepares the cases for review then by the State Department and the Department of Homeland Security. In the case of on the border in Bangkok and Thailand, the IRC operates the overseas processing entity there. In the case of Syria, it's run by something called the International Organization for Migration, IOM. So they do the work and then pass it on. So that's a P1 category, which is a UN High Commissioner for Refugees referral. A P2 category is a family reunification. I believe that's correct. And a P3 category is a further relationship. And then there's a P4. I may have gotten the P's mixed up. There's also a special category for specific religious or other minorities that are specifically at risk. So there, in the Kennedy legislation, there was an encouragement to create further subcategories, and actually I think it's called the P2, so you'd move it all down. The P2 would be the minorities, P3 would be family reunification, P4 would be extended family reunification, and to put religious minorities, to put female-headed households, unaccompanied minors, to get at the most vulnerable within the society. So it sort of expands the categories that the U.S. can bring in. But the underlying criteria is a well-founded fear of persecution. That's a little bit bureaucratic, but that's the bottom line to this system. Does that answer what you were looking for? Yes.
You spoke quite a bit thus far about the governments of Jordan and Syria. I recently caught a C-SPAN conference on this issue where the ambassadors of Jordan and Syria were speaking, and they seemed, as you said, quite open to trying to help. They just don't have the capacity. They're asking for appeals to the international community. Yet, on the other hand, they're still not signatories to the Refugee Convention or Protocol. So it seems that there's going to be a lot of hesitation to provide a lot of assistance from the international community before they become signatories. Do you know how, number one, how open the governments are thus far to that, and if not, what strategies might there be to get them to sign?
I don't know what the likelihood of them signing is. I don't think, frankly, there's a lot of pressure building on them to sign. I think what there is to come up with some interim solutions that would be some kind of temporary legal status, be it work permits, something that allows the refugees to feel that should the government suddenly change, the government's policy change, that they would not be refooled, pushed back, involuntarily returned, forced deportation. So I do think there is some back channel occurring on that, probably to both governments. But that would have to be accompanied by significant international investment, both on a bilateral and on a targeted humanitarian basis, because of the burden that these countries are taking on. And it's significant. I mean, it's impressive when you realize those numbers and then you go and visit the refugees and spend time with them. They recognize that they are, very glad to be away from the violence and the cause of their, what forced them to flee, but they are also very fearful that they could get pushed back into it at any moment. And it's that sense of uncertainty and that sense of fear, and also therefore a sense of a loss of the future, because they've run out of their resources, they can't work, not many of their kids are in school, they can't access health care, they're leading what they consider unproductive lives, family structures break apart, it's just a disaster that's waiting to happen. And you're talking about perhaps, seeing the dissolution of, large numbers of people's lives in a very real way. So this is why you have to tackle it from a number of angles. So I don't know if they're being encouraged to sign. I'm sure they are, but I don't think that's really where the energy is being focused. I think the energy is being focused on what can we find as some temporary solutions that don't box those governments into perhaps having this large caseload for years and years, but more temporary focused solutions on a near-term basis. Yes?
Thanks. You outlined a number of proposals, policy proposals, and steps you'd like to see the federal government take. I'm just interested to know, how does the IRC specifically go about, what are the mechanisms in place to lobby the federal government and to pressure a case?
Well, we advocate. We don't lobby because we're a nonprofit. No. We're like any public interest group. Some of it can be done in a variety of ways. In the case of take Iraq, this particular crisis, we've just issued a comprehensive report that outlines a number of the things that I spoke about today, that was distributed all over Capitol Hill, to the executive branch, to other policy actors, to the media, etc. Actually, I think we'll have an op-ed coming out in tomorrow's New York Times, signed by a number of we called it the IRC Commission on Iraqi Refugees, by 4 of our commissioners. That'll appear in the Times tomorrow, I'm hoping, knock wood. We have face-to-face visits with members of Congress, both on the Senate and House side. We go on television, radio, give interviews to newspapers, cover the media as aggressively as we can. We work with sister agencies and other advocates to push ideas and share, approaches and work as effectively in tandem with others to push ideas up the chain. We'll take an ad out in the newspaper to put it front and center, hold a press conference. I mean, there's a number of mechanisms that can be utilized to undertake this. And very often, some of the most effective ones when you're looking at the USG is also to partner with members of Congress who are trying to push legislation through. So we worked quite closely with Senator Kennedy's team as he was developing his amendment to the Defense Authorization Bill, just in terms of keeping them informed about some of the issues that bill was going to address, and trying to be as supportive a partner in their desire, and his office's desire, and the Senator's desire to get some clarification into U.S. law.
George, I have a question.
you identified the cause of the refugee flight as sectarian violence. By many accounts, a U.S. withdrawal from Iraq will precipitate additional sectarian violence. And so how has that possibility caused the IRC to take a position or to think about taking a position relating to either U.S. withdrawal in and of itself or the pace and nature of U.S. withdrawal from Iraq?
It's an interesting question. We have not gone down that road for two reasons. We've just gone back into Iraq itself in terms of our own security and operations. And secondly, I think there are too many viewpoints as to whether a withdrawal will in fact create greater chaos or could force regional actors who could bring pressure to bear on actors inside the country to perhaps bring greater stability. I mean, there are certainly arguments on either side that would indicate that could foreseeably bring about the conclusions that each side would anticipate or the outcomes. So in that sense, we have not weighed in on that particular aspect of the crisis, because partly I don't think we actually know the answer to it as clearly. I think we can speak more clearly to the fact that we know, if more refugees are resettled, if more resources are made available, if diplomatic engagement is undertaken to look at a humanitarian, that certainly those things will have a ameliorating effect on the crisis. Whereas the level of troop on the ground, you can hear two different debates, and it's harder to make a clearer assessment of that.
Do you have a personal view?
I've gone back and forth on this. I'm not hedging. I'm very uncertain about it, actually. I mean, from a political standpoint, off the record, not speaking as an IRC official, I probably had hoped that that the possibility of a scaled withdrawal with heavy diplomatic energy behind it, on a regional basis as well as internally, might have the effect that we're looking for. But I don't know if that's necessarily true. But that's probably where, if I personally was going to come down. But that's a personal answer, and I probably shouldn't give that, but that's okay. Well, thank you all very much. I very much appreciate it.